The Retirement Cafe podcast, how to apply successfully for NHS Continuing Healthcare with Jacqueline Berry. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Retirement Cafe podcast with me, your host, Justin King. If you're thinking about your retirement or already retired, you're in the right place. My aim is to help you plan for and live a successful and meaningful retirement. Retirement is far more than just a financial event. It's a significant life event, a major transition, which will bring with it new challenges and opportunities. So each episode contains tips, information, and inspiration to help you feel more informed and confident about your retirement. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Hello and welcome to this week's episode. It's great to have you here. Today I'm really pleased to be able to share an information-packed conversation that I had with Jacqueline Berry. This is Jacqueline's second time on the podcast. She appeared in episode 40 back in the summer of 2019. She is the founding director of My Care Consultants, a market leader in helping people navigate the care system in the UK. And she is a fountain of knowledge in all things care related. I was delighted when Jacqueline agreed to come back and chat with me about NHS Continuing Healthcare. It is a complex and often controversial topic because it's a benefit that seems to be so hard to secure. Currently, only around 53,000 people in England are receiving NHS Continuing Healthcare funding, which perhaps reinforces its reputation as one of the most difficult benefits to claim successfully. Jacqueline hopes to help change that, and in our conversation she explains exactly what NHS Continuing Healthcare is and what the eligibility criteria are. She guides us to know how to apply, what you can expect from the application process, and crucially, how to prepare to have the best chance of success. We also chat about some of the challenges you are likely to face during the application process and how to overcome them. Jacqueline has kindly made her detailed guide about NHS Continuing Healthcare available for subscribers to my newsletter. You can subscribe in a couple of ways. Firstly, head to the show notes for this episode, which you can find at theretirementcafe.co.uk. Click on the link on the page for this episode, which is 154. Alternatively, you can head to my care funding webpage on my financial advice website, which is mfpwealthmanagement.co.uk/funding-care, and click the link there. If you are already a subscriber to my weekly newsletter, thank you, and just drop me an email asking for a copy of the guide. I hope you find my conversation with Jacqueline helpful. Welcome to the Retirement Cafe podcast, Jacqueline Berry.
Thank you, Justin. Thanks very much for having me back on.
Yeah, great to see you. Of course, back on. Absolutely. A repeat guest. Not many people get to do that. So, Jacqueline, for those who didn't hear you the first time, and of course, we'll put a link into the show notes where they can go and listen to you on episode 40. But who are you and where are you from?
That's the £1 million question, Justin. So I am Jacqueline Berry. I am from a company called My Care Consultant, and we aim to help members of the public and their family members who need care to navigate the complex and often confusing care systems that operate across the UK. Yeah. So our primary aim is to help people to get the care and support they need in later life.
Absolutely. Now, of course, I have to declare a professional relationship with yourself and My Care Consultants, and we actually have an arrangement where we advise all our clients to speak to you in the event of them needing care. And obviously, as you know, as a Solar advisor, I know quite a lot about the care system and how people can fund it and all that type of thing. But I still want to pass on the initial inquiry to yourselves. So tell me a little bit about how that service works.
Yeah, that's an interesting question, Justin. So we essentially provide the front end advice service, really, that many people need when a care need arises. So the types of things that we get involved in range from helping customers to identify the care that they need and help to set up that care in their local area, but also understand how much that might cost and what might be affordable to them. And part of that conversation involves looking at whether that person that needs care is entitled to any benefits and what help they might be able to get from the local authority or indeed the NHS. And then linked to that, the conversation arises around if somebody is going to be part or fully self-funding, then how might they go about doing that? And that's where we link back to you, Justin, to provide a recommendation around the best way or combination of ways to pay for their care.
Yeah. And of course, I get quite a few calls about this. And obviously, there's two people we get calls from. There's, first of all, our existing clients, who I've often had conversations about, what will happen. And we always try and provide kind of an operating procedure, in essence. Look, if one of you has a stroke tomorrow, what are we going to do? How are we going to deal with it? If one of you becomes incapacitated, so we've discussed wills, we've discussed powers of attorney, we've discussed, what that initial call will be. But then, those clients, I suppose, are reasonably well informed at that point of something happening. And obviously, these things often take us, it can happen suddenly, or if it's a case of slowly progressing in life and becoming a little bit more frail as time goes on, there may become a need at a certain point to go, right, okay, actually, do we now need outside assistance? So there's two aspects there. But the other thing that happens is we just get a call out of the blue from somebody who we haven't had a conversation with before. And they've said, look, we understand that you know about the care system, Justin, and my mother or father or what have you, or maybe it is the person who needs the care. We need some help. And the first thing I always say, of course, is that, where are you? Have you had an initial care assessment? And the answer often is no. They don't know where to go, which of course is what is at the point we often introduce them to have that first 15-minute free phone call with yourselves.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think just to explain how that works, as you rightly said, Justin, you might deal with a client or a family member of a client that needs care who perhaps is looking at planning ahead and might just want to understand how the care system works. But more commonly, we find that it'll be somebody that maybe something happens that escalates a care need overnight, and you can then refer that client or family member to us, and they will receive a completely free 15-minute consultation, which aims to find out more about what's happening. We try to answer some immediate questions and give an initial steer on what to do first. And then there is the option to progress to a chargeable service with us if somebody wants more bespoke, comprehensive support and advice from us. But I think the key point really is just that if somebody needs care, I mentioned earlier, due to the complexity and the devolved nature of our care systems across the UK, the experience that many people receive when navigating the care system is inarguably very different depending on where you live and who you're dealing with in the system. So our business really aims to create that safe space to help families take a step back, work out what they need to know, and then they can go ahead and make informed decisions about their care and funding.
Absolutely. And of course, one thing, in fact, again and again, the conversation I have with people, I'm sure you have the same conversation, is what am I eligible for and what will the state provide and what won't they provide? And again, we'll have a further conversation about obviously the kind of new care provisions and the new care act that is coming into force at the moment. But the one thing I remember a solicitor coming to see me who I've got a connection with, and she said, she said, oh, can you help me with my brother's pension? And I said, well, what's going on? And he said, well, he's had dementia, as you know, for a number of years. But he's, we've really got to, he's living with my mum, and he's really got to go and have some, get some further help, basically. It's impossible for him to live at home any longer. And I said, has he had a care assessment? Well, no. What's that? Well, actually, you may be eligible for lots of benefits, and you may be eligible for quite a lot of help. And then have you come across NHS Continuing Healthcare? No. And this was an informed lady, smart, in the world of family law, a matrimonial expert, pretty au fait with lots of legislation, but was totally unaware of these things because she'd never had to deal with them before. Why should you know about the care provision in the UK if you don't kind of look at it on a regular basis? So this NHS Continuing Healthcare, what is it?
Yeah, I mean, if I just take a step back before addressing that specific question, Justin, the starting point for anybody that is in need of later life care is to try to identify whether the primary need for care is more of a social care nature or a healthcare nature. And what I mean by that is as follows. So social care typically relates to daily activities. So maybe the ability to get dressed, wash oneself, maybe make meals, maybe go to the toilet and things like that. And that is social care, and that is the remit of the local authorities. That is means tested and always has been. In contrast, healthcare falls into the remit of the NHS, and it's really described as where somebody has an illness, they may have received a diagnosis, or they've had an accident that results in complex health needs. And there are two assessment pathways that identify whether somebody needs social care, and if so, whether they are entitled to any support from their local authority or not, funding or practical or otherwise. And then there is a separate assessment pathway for identifying whether somebody is deemed eligible for NHS Continuing Healthcare funding, which is available for those with a primary healthcare need. So to summarise, the care systems are separated into two areas. You have different organisations responsible for delivering those assessments and the funding where relevant. And for most people who haven't got any prior experience of navigating the systems, how do they know where on earth to start, and indeed the question to ask? And that's where we can come in.
Right. So if you think that, this dementia scenario is a tricky one, isn't it? There appears to be some people who seem to be provided for. In fact, this gentleman was provided for. His dementia was of a significant nature and of a young age that actually the NHS Continuing Healthcare did step in and provide for him. But there seems to be other people who the dementia doesn't, they don't appear to be getting the NHS Continuing Healthcare. So how does this how does this work? Do you know?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, the first thing I want to stress is that the number of people that are eligible for NHS Continuing Healthcare varies dramatically. And if I give you some stats on that, it really varies dramatically from 28 to 356 people per 50,000 population, depending on where the individual is living. Now, those figures are quite drastic, and I can tell you that they cannot be explained. And the fact that that variation even exists suggests that there are differences in the ways that clinical commissioning groups who are responsible for assessing for that funding conduct the assessments in line with the national framework. So that's the starting point, which partly explains the confusion and the, I guess, variation around who qualifies, why and when. Addressing your question around dementia specifically, dementia is an illness that predominantly happens to those in later life, although it can happen at any age. And certainly I've seen cases developing dementia as young as in their 30s. And the situation with dementia is that it's a progressive illness. So the early stages, Justin, tend to be the side effects tend to be relatively minor. So talking about things like memory loss and maybe getting a bit confused and things that aren't particularly serious. But in the latter stages, somebody can develop quite substantial nursing needs, such as sort of medication to help address infections that might set in due to organ failure, which can be one of the side effects of dementia in the later years. And that is one example of a nursing care need. And going back to my point that I raised earlier around the definition of healthcare versus social care, healthcare is applicable where somebody has been diagnosed with an illness, or they have a condition, or they've had an accident, and as a result they have substantial healthcare needs. So in itself, it's not the illness that it may be labelled dementia or cancer or whatever else it might be. It's the side effects, the needs that derive from living with that illness. And like I say, in the early stages of any of those illnesses, somebody may not be deemed to have healthcare needs. And this is why there is an assessment that is aimed at deciphering whether somebody does have a primary need for healthcare. And that is where there is some subjectivity that sadly does exist across the demographic areas.
Right. And so in the first instance, who's responsible for getting this assessment or providing the assessment?
Yeah, and I'll explain that. But one point I think that's useful to start by mentioning is that NHS Continuing Healthcare is not universally available across the UK.
Right.
So in Scotland, it was replaced by hospital-based complex clinical care in 2015.
Right.
And it's essentially a single question that is asked to determine whether somebody needs NHS care or whether they would enter the social care system, which is means tested. And that question is as follows: it's, can your care needs be properly met in any other setting than hospital? And if the answer is no, you would receive your NHS funded care in hospital. If the answer is yes, you would be discharged from hospital into the appropriate care setting, and then the relevant local authority assessment processes would kick in to look at what you need and who pays for that care. Likewise, in Northern Ireland, the government recently followed Scotland's approach and basically introduced a single question approach. That was in February 2021. And that question addresses the very same thing. Can your needs be appropriately met in any other setting other than hospital? And if the answer is yes, you would be discharged into the social care system, and that is means tested. So in England and Wales, NHS Continuing Healthcare can be available in any setting. And essentially, there is an assessment process which has been established to determine whether somebody is eligible. That assessment process comes in two stages. So the first stage is referred to as the checklist assessment. That is a screening initial assessment which is aimed at determining whether somebody should progress to the official full assessment. In other words, do they have healthcare needs, and should they be transferred to the next stage in the assessment process? Obviously, if somebody doesn't have healthcare needs at that point, the checklist would outline that, and that would be the end of their assessment pathway. The second stage is essentially a full assessment, which is conducted by something called a multidisciplinary team. That assessment can last typically up to sort of 2 hours. And the multidisciplinary team is usually a group of 3 individuals. Often you'll have at least one, possibly 2 clinicians, which specialise in different areas. So you might have a specialist in dementia or cognitive related illnesses, and then perhaps a cardiac specialist. And the idea there is that you would get a broad view and from 2 specialist areas when looking at the qualifying criteria to make sure that it's as fair as possible. And then the third individual would usually be a social worker or possibly a nurse, or in some instances, a care home manager or something. And that assessment process looks at a number of different healthcare categories, which are officially referred to as domains. And those domains are then assessed as to the level of need somebody has in each of those domains. So one example of a domain is mobility. So does somebody have mobility problems? How extensive or complex are they? And that is then sort of looked at in its own merit, and somebody is given a grading as to what their level of need is. And then at the end of that assessment, the recommendation is made by this multidisciplinary team, and that recommendation is given to the clinical commissioning group, which is the body responsible for making a decision on whether somebody is deemed eligible for this funding, and indeed administering funding directly. So it's long-winded. That's hopefully as easily summarised as I can, but that's generally the steps that are involved in accessing a decision around whether someone's eligible or not.
Wow. Gosh, and in your experience, how long does it take?
The assessment itself or the application process, Justin?
Well, I suppose the point of when you think, well, I need assessment, and then the point of I know whether I'm going to get continuing healthcare or not.
Yeah. So firstly, the COVID pandemic, unfortunately, has created this backlog in requests for assessments. And in September 2020, we were sitting at 25,000 assessments that had built up because all of the stage 2 assessments were actually put on hold from March to September 2020 in light of the pandemic to essentially enable hospital staff and clinical commissioning groups to get people the care they needed much more quickly. That's one of the reasons, but I would be here all day if I went into the detail around what else is going on. But as a result of that, people applying for this assessment now are typically having to wait longer than normal. So I mentioned there are 2 stages. Stage 1, the checklist, can be very easily conducted within days of a request. Okay, a number of professionals can carry that assessment out if they have the right qualifications. So a social worker, a nurse, a GP, and in many instances, senior staff at care homes or care providers can actually conduct a checklist. And that stage 1 assessment is critical because even if you're then waiting weeks for your stage 2 assessment, if you are transferred to that stage, if funding is later awarded, it is backdated to the 29th day of when the checklist happened. So in other words, get your checklist assessment. You can ask for it through your GP or you can approach your local authority. You can approach your local clinical commissioning group directly, and you can find the details online as to who that is by typing in your postcode. Get your checklist done, and then even if you're waiting weeks, which is very probable for most people, then it can be backdated. One thing to mention, where somebody is seriously ill and considered to be entering a final phase in life, they can request something called a fast track pathway, which is where an assessment could happen within 24 hours. And that would normally be triggered automatically because somebody in that situation would be very, very unwell, Justin.
Yeah, gosh. And how many people who speak to you and contact my care consultant are calling about, this assessment? So
interestingly, and probably not surprisingly, increasing numbers of people are contacting us about this very issue. Yeah. And typically, 2 years ago, we'd probably find 1 in 8 queries would be about NHS Continuing Healthcare specifically. Now it's more like 1 in 4. And obviously we provide advice on the whole realm of later life care planning and NHS Continuing Healthcare funding, and the assessment process is one of many categories we would cover off with clients. But this is certainly on the rise, and in my view, the reason that is the reason for that is because there's this backlog in people waiting for assessments. You've got this subjectivity around, the qualifying criteria and the fact that we have, variations in sort of how it's applied within the framework, and that causes confusion. And also, there doesn't tend to be much information unless you know where to go to ask for it and what to ask. You don't tend to have that proactive approach where you are given information about how the assessment works, what to prepare, and so on. And that really is quite baffling for people. And on top of that, people are often dealing with this at a stressful time in their lives, whether it's the individual that needs care themselves or more often a loved one who is trying to navigate all of this on behalf of their family member, and frankly is feeling all sorts of emotions because of that weight on their shoulders. They want to do the right thing. So it's sadly an increasing area of need, but help is out there, and people should know they're not on their own. They can seek help.
Yeah, and specifically, what can my care consultant do for people who are going through this process?
Yeah, really good question. So we help people from helping to prepare for the assessment itself. So what we do is we go through the assessment tool that is used in the stage 2 of the assessment, which looks at those health domains I mentioned. And I gave mobility as one example of one of those domains. And we actually talk to the family members about, the individual that's being assessed. We find out what their needs are. Obviously, things like what medication they're receiving and important information like have there been any recent changes in behaviour or any incidences that have occurred, like a fall. All of that stuff is really relevant when it comes to this assessment. So we help our families prepare. We use the criteria that's used in the official assessment, and we compare the individual that needs care, their needs against that. So we really help the families understand what the assessment looks like, how to prepare, the sorts of questions they need to ask, and the documents that they might need to prepare as well. So things like making sure that up-to-date care plans are produced by the care providers, that families have a copy of a hospital discharge plan if there is one, if the loved one has recently been in hospital, and even things like asking for some commentary from care providers around their observations of their loved one in the recent weeks, because there can often be quite drastic changes that the assessment team won't necessarily pick up on through documents, that actually that input can make a massive difference. So we help our families with that. And we also help with the other end of the assessment process. So if people want to contest an eligibility decision, or indeed make retrospective claims where perhaps their relative wasn't assessed and they have sadly now passed away. And actually that's an interesting one because of the assessments that were put on hold throughout the pandemic. There's a number of cases in that category where maybe their loved one didn't receive an assessment and probably would have otherwise received one had those assessments not been put on hold, and they've now passed away. So that's an area we can help in as well.
Wow. Yeah, it's complex. So there obviously is as you mentioned, there is a right to challenge the decision if you feel it's been made unfairly. The obviously feels to me that with this huge diversity of people in different local authorities, some proportions of people receiving continuing healthcare or not, as the case may be, it is obviously very subjective to who's receiving it, and so there may be quite a few people who want to challenge the decision. How does that actual process work?
Yeah, and I think what I would always say what I say to our clients and family members is there has to be a basis for wanting to challenge a decision, and usually people would, have grounds to challenge a decision where information that would have otherwise been available wasn't taken into account in the official assessment process. So what you're really looking for is, the assessment team hasn't taken into account information that would have otherwise potentially influenced a decision. The other reason that could justify the means to contest a decision would be where perhaps there was disagreements in the assessment itself. And I always urge families, when they're attending these assessments with their loved one and the assessment team, make notes of, who says what, if there are any disagreements, who said it and why, because those disagreements can actually really make a difference between the level that someone's graded at, whether that's a priority level, which is the highest, or if it might be a severe or a moderate. Those differentiations can be the difference between being eligible and not being eligible. So they're the sorts of reasons why somebody would contest a decision, and we will be very honest about that with families. We do also have outsourced nurses that work with our team that have sat in these assessments and are very experienced in dealing with the language and understanding whether an assessment criteria has potentially not been recorded properly, or as I say, there hasn't been information that could have been used that was neglected for whatever reason. And that's why I always say, families, you're better to prepare and get everything ready up front than be on the back foot and deal with the contesting of a decision. So in order to do that, it's making sure all the documents that are used, like care plans, like GP reports, like hospital discharge plans, are all up to date. And the care provider, if there is one, can provide an up-to-date summary of what the current needs are, because people's needs can change overnight. And often there is an escalated need overnight for more complex care that may have been triggered by a fall or something that's happened suddenly. And GP notes aren't always going to record that. Likewise, hospital discharge notes may not record that. So that information is so important. And if that isn't used for whatever reason, somebody could contest that. And normally the contesting process is separated into 2 or 3 stages. So you would initially contact the clinical commissioning group, which is the body responsible for deciding who is eligible for this funding and who isn't. And you would need to document your reasons why you're contesting that. You need to do that within 6 months of the initial assessment decision. And you would then receive a response from them, and that would normally then proceed, if needed, to a disciplinary meeting, which is where a new assessment team would look at the decision support tool, which is the document used to record somebody's assessment results, and they would review it again, essentially. So it would be a different set of specialists, and that's really important to make sure that it's a sort of a fair sort of decision. And then, of course, if the decision still wasn't overturned, if an individual felt that there was still grounds to contest and they weren't happy with that, they could take the case to the Health Service Ombudsman, which is kind of the third step in the process. And that's an independent body which is responsible for helping to clear up, I suppose, disagreements or disputes or issues that may occur within healthcare systems. So that's kind of the 3-step process. And the critical point is do it within 6 months of that initial eligibility decision.
Yeah. And presumably, of course, if you, you could be refused continuing healthcare, and then, but of course, you could become more poorly and therefore feel that you then become eligible. How does that work?
Yeah, so the continuing healthcare funding is not an indefinite stream of funding for anybody, no matter what age you are. It is available for those with, health needs that are usually of a complex or an unpredictable or sort of an intense nature that need managing. And those needs could improve. So somebody could have very good hospital treatment or move into a home that they suddenly receive the dedicated care they need, and their condition improves. So in other words, somebody may not qualify within an assessment, and a month later may actually be deemed eligible because their needs change. And likewise, somebody that may have been deemed eligible for funding, if their needs improve, they could have that funding retracted. So what normally happens is you'll have an assessment. If you are deemed eligible, there's another assessment 3 months later to just address that you're receiving the care that you need and that the programme is working. And then it's an assessment every year after that point. And that's where it, if your needs have changed, then the funding decision could change. The other thing just to mention is that there is a second part of this funding called funded nursing care. And somebody might be told that they're not eligible for the full funded package, but that they might be eligible for funded nursing care, which is a payment of just over £200 a week to people that live in a nursing care home. And that's paid by the NHS towards that person's nursing care fees. So, you might find you receive that decision, and that's something to keep on track of, because somebody that's in receipt of that clearly has healthcare needs, but they're not complex or unpredictable or intense enough to qualify for the full package. But they may be in months or years to come. So you can request a new assessment if that's not triggered automatically, if somebody's needs change.
Yeah. And, this is complicated stuff, isn't it? And I know that recently that you wrote a guide that you provided to me to provide to my clients on continuing healthcare funding, which has been just fantastically received. And, I'm extremely grateful for having that available to my clients. Tell me a little bit about that.
Oh, thank you, Justin. I have to say, we've spent many, many months producing this guide, and we feel that this guide is really the first of its kind from what we can see from other documents that are out there. We really tried to strike a balance between, not overwhelming people with the technical jargon and all of the information that's out there around how the assessment process works and what's involved, with sort of practical tips that actually help people understand, what to do to get a fair outcome. Because, what we've been talking about today predominantly is around the process itself and how it's carried out. But indeed, in order to prepare and make sure that somebody gets a fair outcome, there are some practical steps that can be taken to make sure that happens first time. And we've taken our 7 years of experience of dealing directly with consumers, navigating the process, and the relevant organisations involved, like the clinical commissioning groups and local authorities. Yeah. And we've pulled that really valuable practical insight into this guide. So I really hope it helps as many people as possible, frankly, make sense of a very complex assessment process and get the right outcome first time.
Absolutely. And of course, my clients can receive a copy of that guide, and my subscribers to my newsletter. So we'll put a link in the show notes if you want to get a copy of that and subscribe to our newsletter. It is only available to our subscribers, I'm afraid, but obviously it's just a sign up link for if you want to do that and get a copy of that really, really valuable guide. So, Jacqueline Berry, thank you so much for explaining all of that once again to our listeners and to our watchers on YouTube, of course. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks, Justin. Always a pleasure.
Thank you once again to Jacqueline for tackling this complex topic. You'll find links to My Care Consultant's website and other useful content on our website at theretirementcafe.co.uk. And remember, the link to sign up for my weekly newsletter and receive the free guide to NHS Continuing Healthcare is also on the webpage. Any problems signing up, please email hello@theretirementcafe.co.uk. As ever, if you've enjoyed this episode, please do leave us a review on Apple Podcasts, as it really helps more people like you find us. And for more interviews and retirement planning videos, you may want to check out my YouTube channel, which is Justin King MFP. Or click the link in the show notes. So until next time, I'm Justin King, helping you feel more informed in your retirement.